كلية الفقه الحنفي تقدم.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah. So today, inshallah, we will be doing the 14 categories of distribution from the estate of the deceased. So the estate that the deceased has left behind, what do we do with that? What's the first thing that will happen with that estate or to that estate? Okay, so that's what we're going to be doing. There are 14 categories, one by one, in list order of priority. We'll go through them in list in the order of priority. So you give first the estate to the first category, then second, then third, then fourth, and you carry on going like this. So we will go through all of those categories, the 14 categories. We'll just list them for now, and inshallah later as we go along, I will detail each one of the 14 categories. Some of them won't really be applicable nowadays, but because these are the ones that are mentioned in the books, I will just mention them. But obviously we'll spend more time on those ones which are relevant to us. So these are the 14 categories that we'll be doing. We'll go through details today of the first, which is the burial and shrouding. Then we will talk about repayment of debts. So that we will go through in terms of different types of debts and what if the debts are more than the estate, and all of those rulings we'll go through inshallah. Then we'll do some detail in regards to the bequest, the wasiyah that a person has made. If there is a bequest, all the different rules in regards to that we'll cover inshallah today. There's quite a few rulings. We'll go through that inshallah. Then we'll also go through what are the legal ramifications if a person does not have a will in place. What will happen according to UK law? What will happen to this deceased estate? And we'll go through these rulings. So there's rulings that the government have sanctioned, the rulings of intestacy, a person that leaves behind no will, and then we'll also talk about inheritance tax. So we'll briefly talk about the inheritance tax, where 40% of the estate can be taxed. When will it be taxed at 40%? Is there an allowance? We'll go through a nil rate allowance where there's no tax for, and I think we will leave it there today. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah. So now for today's session, we'll be moving on to categories of distribution. So there are 14 categories amongst whom the estate of the deceased will be distributed. So this is important to understand first before we move on to actually distributing in accordance to the shares that we have mentioned, because the estate of the deceased, as we can see over here. So the estate of the deceased will be distributed in the following necessary order of priority. First, what will happen with the estate of the deceased, we will use this money, we'll use this estate for preparing for the burial and shrouding of the deceased themselves, which we call the tajheez wa takfeen. Then we move on, if there's money left over after, or if there's any sort of estate left over after utilizing the money for the preparation of the burial and shrouding. And obviously the preparation for the burial and shrouding would be done in accordance to their normal, in terms of the cloth that will be bought and things like this will be in accordance to how they used to live a life during their life. It won't be extravagantly spending on it so that all of the money gets used up as well. But we won't be so cheap that we barely give them anything to be covering their body on, or they're covering their body with, should I say. So after the estate is being used for the tajheez al-takfeen. Now remember, this doesn't necessarily mean you have to use the money. Somebody else wants to donate the money and say that I will pay for the burial and shrouding, no problem. But the point is here that if there is no one to do that, which nobody has to actually do, then the costs of the burial and shrouding will come from the actual estate that the deceased has left behind first. If there is left over, then we will fulfill debts that the deceased has left behind, which we'll talk about in detail. Then we will utilize this money for bequests, fulfilling the bequests that the deceased has made. And now 1/3 of the leftover. So after the burial and shrouding, after the debts, whatever is left over, 1/3 of that will be used for the bequests. And if there is anything left over after this, then we will give to the fixed Quranic shareholders, which we have already learnt about who they are and what their shares are, which are called the Dhawil Furud. Then we will give to agnetic shareholders, which are the Asabat, which we call Asabat and Nasabi, agnetic shareholders, the ones that receive the rest of the share. So if you remember, we talked about the father and so on. They were becoming agnetic shareholder, meaning receiving the rest of the estate. If there is left over, then meaning if there isn't anybody, there's no agnetic shareholder, then it will, number 6, go to emancipation shareholder, which are the Asabat as-Sababi, in essence, slaves who were freed, or the ones that freed the slave, should I say. But we will talk about that more in detail later. Number 7, return to fixed Quranic shareholder, Rad bidawil furud. So if the above categories aren't really there, then we will return the shares to number 4, meaning whatever is left over, we will give it amongst number 4 again. Number 8 is womb relation shareholders. So those of the relatives who are besides the Dhawil Furud and Asabat. So like your mother's side of the family and so on. Number 9 is voluntary liability shareholders, the Mawlal Mawalat. We will talk about this in detail later. Number 10, relative whose relation is based on an unsubstantiated claim, which we call muqarr lahu bin nasabi ala al-ghayr. And again, we'll shed some light on this later. Number 11, one bequeathed the entire estate. So Musa lahu bi jami'il mal. And number 12, the public treasury, the state treasury, Baytul Mal. Number 13, return to spouses, Rad bi zawjain. Just like we had the Rad bi dhawil furud, now we will return to the zawjain because they're not dhawil furud and nasabi. So we will give them later. And again, all of these details will be coming in the next few slides, inshallah. And then lastly, we'll give to zakat eligible Muslims if there is no spouse, if there is no there's no Baytul Mal like nowadays, there's none of the above categories. We have a state of the deceased left over, then we'll just give it to the zakat eligible Muslims. Now, each one we will detail. So the first one, like I already explained, this is the foremost obligation after death. The expense for burial and shrouding are prioritized and should be covered from the deceased's estate, even if it exhausts the entire estate. All the estate goes, doesn't matter, we will utilize this money first. One should neither be extravagant nor miserly when purchasing cloth for the shroud. A moderate way must be adopted. So a similar quality of cloth as the one used by the deceased in their lifetime should be purchased for the shroud. One should also not exceed or reduce the required number of sheets to shroud a person, 3 for males and 5 for females, as this would otherwise be regarded as extravagance or miserliness, respectively. So this is something to bear in mind when buying or when purchasing the burial shrouding. So this is the cost, and I've already explained, if somebody wants to take on this cost, like generally the children take on this cost, then that's entirely up to them. Then the estate of the deceased doesn't have to be used for this. Then if there's leftover, we said we go to repayment of debts. So following the costs of burial and shrouding, the next obligation is to settle debts, even if it depletes the remaining estate. So debts can be categorized into 2 types, we'll say. First is debts to human beings, the hukuk al-ibad, such as money owed to a friend, or debts to Allah, hukukullah, such as expiation for missed fasts. So if a person's missed some fast and they have to give some expiation, monetary expiation, that would be coming under hukukul ibad. Or if there's zakat payments not being paid, then that's all hukukullah, should I say, sorry. Now, debts owed to human beings will be paid from the entire estate of the deceased, even if they have not bequeathed it. On the contrary, debts owed to Allah cannot be paid using the estate of the deceased unless they make a bequest up to the maximum 1/3 of the estate. So up to the maximum 1/3 of the estate can be utilized to pay these hukukullah debts. Okay, so when we're talking about repayment of debts over here, this needs to be understood, the differentiation between hukukullah and hukukul ibad. If they have not made a bequest, the inheritors may choose to pay the deceased's debts, whatever the debts are, from their own wealth. That's up to them. If they want to pay from their own wealth, that's for the hukukullah we're talking about. For example, if the deceased had missed obligatory fasts, the inheritors can give the equivalent of sadaqatul fitr for each fast, and that will come from their own money. And obviously that can be, the amount that they're receiving from the deceased estate. They can use that for them, for the payment. That's up to them. So bearing in mind this, now what's important is to understand there's levels, different types of debts. So there'll be a hierarchy, as we call it, of the debts. The common question is how to divide the estate when the deceased has more debt than estates and owes different creditors. In such cases, the category of debt determined is, it's obviously it's according to the priorities that we're talking about now. So the category of debt determines its priority. So what we're talking about is debts are prioritized based on their proof and confession by the deceased. So it's either going to be there's proof and there's going to be confession, or either of the two. So this will become clear, inshallah, from the category. So we got the strongest type of debt. This is where a person confesses to the debt in good health. So whilst they're in good health, they confess that I owe so-and-so person this much money. So like an example, he says, I owe Zaid £100. And there was also accompanying proof. There was concrete proof to prove this, like an invoice or something like this. This is the strongest type of debt there can be. Number two is strong debt. The person confessed to this debt during their illness before death. So during the death illness, the person confessed to this debt, and there is proof for it. There is proof for it, but they confessed to it during their death illness. Medium debt would be there is proof of the debt, but no confession from the debtor. Okay, so hopefully this is understood now that you got strongest, strong, and medium debt. So if there was debts incurred which were above the asset, more than the asset. So now how do you, if there's one person who's owed strongest debt and another person who's owed a strong debt, then we will utilize the estate first to fulfill the strongest type of debt. And then we will, whatever's left over, if there's any left over, then we will give to the strong debt. And if there's left over, then we will give the rest of the money to the medium debt. If there's nothing left over, the person who is owed this medium debt won't get anything back. So that's the way it works. And just to finish off the categories, you got a weak debt. So this is where there's no proof of the debt, but the debtor confessed to it in good health. Then you have a weaker debt. So this is where there is no proof for the debt. There's no proof, and the debtor confessed to it during their illness before death. So in the death illness, they confess to it. And lastly, the weakest debt is there's no proof for the debt, nor any confession. I'm sure we can understand logically all of these types of debts now. And like I explained previously, priority is given to stronger debts over weaker ones. If debts are equal strength, then they will be settled proportionately. So if there is two strongest debts, so if one of them is taking up 50% of the estate, the other one is taking 50% of the estate, then, but meaning if, for example, let's just say there's two types of strongest debts, and one person is owed £100, the other person is owed, for example, £200. So the ratio between them is 1 to 2. So when you have the estate of the deceased, which let's just imagine the estate of the deceased is only £90. So when we distribute it, we will give the person who's owed £100 only £30 from it, because the £90 will be distributed into 3 portions. So one person will get 1 part, the other one who's owed £200 will get 2 parts, so he will get £60. So £60 for him and £30 for him, and that's it. We've spent the entire estate. The estate is gone now. So that's the way we proportion it. That's what he means by it will be settled proportionately. Now to move on, if there are invalid debts. So what do you mean by invalid debts? So these are debts such as gambling fines or interest payments, which are not recognized because they're not recognized in the Sharia and cannot be paid from the estate. If enforced legally by creditors, these debts may only be settled from the estate when no other recourse is available. So that's the way this invalid debts according to Sharia works. Now moving on to number 3 category is bequests, the wasiyah. So this is the third obligation that must be fulfilled using the deceased person's estate. A bequest can be made for up to 1/3 of the remaining estate after burial costs and repayment of debts. So after the first 2 have been fulfilled, if the deceased made a bequest to give certain amount of money, for example, to a charitable project, to a masjid, whatever, then whatever's left over after using the money for the first 2 categories, the burial and debts, whatever's left over, maximum 1/3 of it will be given to that cause. So verbal and written declarations of the bequest are equally valid. The one who makes a bequest can revoke their bequest whilst alive, either verbally or again in writing in written format as well is allowed. Now, a will cannot be made for anything that contradicts the Sharia, meaning a bequest cannot be made, a will cannot be made, such as purchasing alcohol or funding a certain sinful project or something, right? A Muslim can make a will, meaning a bequest, for a non-Muslim, and vice versa. A non-Muslim can also make a bequest for a Muslim receiving a certain amount of their estate. If the amount stated in the will, meaning in the estate, in the bequest, exceeds 1/3, the excess can only be given from the share of those inheritors who consent. So if there's only a few inheritors who say, don't worry, they wanted to give more to this masjid, for example, we're allowing it. So only from their share, the excess will be given. Consent of an heir is only valid if they are mature and sane. So if amongst the heirs there is a person who is not baligh yet, who has not reached maturity, and if we are taking permission from all of the heirs that, look, our mother or our father, gave this much money to this masjid, wanted to give this much money to this masjid, but that exceeds 1/3. Are you happy? Everyone's happy, but this child, this person who is not mature yet, their consent cannot be taken yet, because even if they say, yes, I'm happy, it doesn't matter. You cannot use their share whilst they are still not mature. Once they reach maturity, that's up to them what they do with that. And obviously, a sane persons as well, consent cannot be done. Even if their guardian consents, that guardian's consent will not be taken into consideration. Now, if the inheritors do not consent and the bequest is for more than one recipient of different rankings. So the bequest was given to was for different people or different avenues. Higher priority recipients will be given preference. So if ranks are equal, the amount will be divided proportionately between them. Just as I explained previously, for example, a bequest is to discharge unpaid zakat will be given priority over optional charity, for example, right? So therefore, zakat obviously was an obligatory due on the deceased, and they made a request to fulfill the zakat as well as giving money to this masjid. Then we will first prioritize giving the money to discharge the zakat. Anything left over, then we will give to that, because obviously of differing ranks, as you can understand. Obviously, if there is equal, so for example, zakat as well as payments for compensation payments for missed fasts, so they're both necessary, then, and there's not enough money to give to both fully, then you're going to have to do the proportion, the ratio, like I explained earlier in the debts case. So bequests can be made for anyone. You can make a bequest for anybody. However, if it's made for an heir who is receiving a share, they're already receiving a share, they will only receive the bequest if all other inheritors consent. This is based on the statement of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There is no bequest for an heir unless the other heirs permit. Okay, so this is a hadith mentioned in Surah Dar-Qutni. So this is to take into consideration. If a bequest is made, like commonly a bequest is made that this house is going to go for this son of mine, that's invalid because it's a bequest for a heir that's already an heir. La wasiyata li warith. But if the others agree, then that's fine. Now, if the bequest was made for an heir who at the time of death was not entitled due to the presence of a higher priority heir. So let's say, for example, a bequest was made for a grandson or for a granddaughter, but the son was still there. So because the son is there, the grandson will not get anything. So it will be implemented up to 1/3, meaning the grandson will get up to 1/3 provided all inheritors again consent. Now, if the bequest was made for an heir who was excluded due to intentionally murdering the deceased, they will not inherit. However, if the murder was unintentional, they can receive the bequest if all inheritors consent again. Moving on to continue the rulings of bequest. If the bequest was made for an heir who was excluded due to other preventing factors such as being a non-Muslim, they can receive the bequest if all inheritors consent again. That's provided that it's if it's going above. All of these is if all inheritors consent is when it's above the amount of that 1/3. If it's within the 1/3, then they are going to be given anyway, because it's necessary to fulfill this bequest of the deceased. If a person makes a bequest that a certain individual can benefit from their property as long as this individual remains alive, such a bequest will not be valid unless the other inheritors all consent, as it would entail delaying the distribution of this portion of the estate. For example, a husband, this is the practical thing that normally people do. A husband makes a bequest that his wife can reside in his house as long as she remains alive, and only thereafter, only after she passes away, should it be distributed, meaning should the house be distributed to the other heirs. This bequest will only be implemented if all the other inheritors consent, because it is their share and they are entitled to their share. If the deceased had allocated certain parts of their estate to certain inheritors, so they said, this gold goes to this daughter of mine, this house or this car goes to this son of mine, like this, they would receive this allocated portion only if all the other inheritors consent. For example, a mother had allocated that her gold would be inherited by her daughter. If that gold was equal to or less than the daughter's share of the estate, she would receive all of it as long as the other inheritors consent. If that gold exceeds the daughter's share, she would only receive up to her share unless the other inheritors all consent that she may take more than her entitled share. A person whose majority statements and actions have become nonsensical due to old age is regarded as senile, and any transactions they conduct in their wealth, regarding their wealth, will not be valid. For example, they revoke a bequest made whilst they were sane. So they made a bequest whilst they were sane, and whilst they become senile, they revoke it somehow. They say, oh, you're not getting anything. I don't want to give you anything anymore. Or they say something else. They say, this is all going to this son or daughter of mine. This won't be valid. Okay, this kind of statement where majority statements or actions are no longer sensical, then when the person becomes senile like this, then their statements are not taken. The death illness of a terminally ill, death illness or the illness of the death of the terminally ill person is when the probability of them dying is dominant over their likelihood of living, and they are approaching death. Okay, so obviously the doctors have said that this person is nearing the last moments. The death illness of a person who is not terminally ill is when the symptoms of death are apparent, such that they are unable to undertake their regular tasks. So they are unable to utilize the toilet themselves, and they're unable to get up and go get water for themselves and things like this. The daily normal chores that they would do, they're unable to do. Any transaction made in the estate during this death illness will be legally considered a bequest. So if they were to give the money away in this time, that would be a bequest. Or whatever they were to do in transactions in that estate, they bought something, they did whatever, that's a bequest. For example, a person in this state donates all their wealth to charity. This charity will only be valid up to 1/3 of the estate, as a bequest can only be fulfilled up to 1/3 of the total estate. Now, what will happen if a person dies without a will? When a person dies without leaving a valid will, their estate will be shared out according to the laws of their country, which likely will be contrary to the stipulations of Sharia. These laws in the UK are known as the laws of intestacy. You can check this online. If you type in laws of intestacy, you will see all the laws. I will try to go through quickly certain main points of the law anyway, according to the UK. And in other countries, like in the US, is known as intestate succession laws. Something along these lines will be in relative countries. The only way to avoid this from happening is by ensuring that there is a valid Islamic will in place. If there's a valid will in place, obviously we want you to have an Islamic will. As Rasulullah ﷺ obviously has mentioned, it is not permitted for any Muslim who has something to will to remain 2 nights without having his last will written and kept ready with him. So this is important, that a person should have a will. A simple will can do as well, which we will go through later on, inshallah. So legal ramifications of not having an Islamic will. In the UK, when a person dies without leaving a valid will, their estate must be shared out according to certain rules. These are called the laws of intestacy and are as follows. If they have surviving children, grandchildren, or great-grandchildren, and the estate is valued at more than 270,000, the partner will inherit, the partner meaning the spouse who is left behind will inherit all the personal property and belongings of the deceased. The 270 will go to them directly. The first 270 of the estate will go to them as well. Half of the remaining estate, so whatever is remaining beyond that, above the 270, they'll receive half of it. and the remaining half will go to the children. So if there are no surviving children, grandchildren, or great-grandchildren, the partner will inherit the entire estate. Okay, and obviously, as we've understood previously, this is different to how Shariat stipulates it. If there is no surviving partner, the children of the deceased will inherit the whole estate. This applies, and then obviously, because of leaving the estate to the children, the rate will go up as well in terms of tax rates will be less. Anyway, this is something to take into consideration by seeing a suitable solicitor, a tax advisor. Anyway, this applies regardless of how much the estate is worth. Okay, that regardless of how much the estate is worth, it will go to the children. If there is more than one child, the estate will be divided equally between them, regardless of being male or female. And again, as we understand, that is contrary to what Shariat says. If there is no surviving partner or children, the parents, siblings, and nieces and nephews will inherit. If none of the above remain, then grandparents, uncles, and aunts, aunties and cousins will inherit. For further detail, you can check the government website out on this link. Now, obviously, we can see these laws are contrary to Islamic stipulation, right? Therefore, the wealth must then be redistributed after going to, let's say, the wealth went all to the spouse. After she took or he took all of the inheritance, they now must distribute that in accordance to what Islamic laws of inheritance are, because they have got something which is not theirs. It's not them, they're not entitled to it. So unfortunately, this redistribution cannot be legally enforced, and inheritors are often unwilling to give up the extra wealth that they have gained. They say the country has given it to me, so why should I give it up? Which eventually leads to family, ties being broken. Hence, to ensure that the estate is distributed Islamically, at the first instance, one must ensure they have a legal will, valid Islamic will in place. So this is very important. We always recommend this just to give you a graphic to understand what happens here, because that's a little bit complicated maybe for some. So you got person A passes away and has a legally valid Islamic will. If this is the case, then what will happen? Distribution will be according to Sharia. Very easy and straightforward. If, however, they do not have a valid Islamic will, or they have no valid will in place, what happens? The distribution is according to laws of intestacy. Okay, that much is very easy to understand, hopefully. Now what happens? Obviously, they can mutually amongst themselves distribute according to Sharia, and that's all good if they do that. But unfortunately, what most people will do is this: the distribution will be contrary to Sharia, and they will keep that whatever was distributed to them, they will keep it. And that's where the problem will arise. So this is why it's important to write a legally valid Islamic will. So given Sharia is not recognized under state law, the easiest way to enforce Sharia is to have a will in place. Some choose to place their wealth under a trust. You can place it under a trust. A trust obviously is a distinct legal entity. For tax purposes, people like to do this, recognized by the state. It is controlled by trustees on behalf of the beneficiaries, the recipients of that trust, who would typically be the family members. Specific trustees can be nominated within the will, who would be legally required to follow Sharia principles when distributing assets to the beneficiaries. However, this should be done after consulting a knowledgeable solicitor. Many couples choose to own their home in joint. This is a separate point. So a lot of couples, they have their home in joint names, usually held under joint tenancy. So joint tenancy, that's the way that couples generally will have a property. This means upon the death of a partner, ownership of the asset will automatically pass entirely to the surviving partner, because joint tenancy means when one passes away, the entire estate will now go to that joint tenancy holder, regardless of what is stated in the will. You can have a will in place, doesn't matter. Okay, if it's a joint tenancy, it will entirely go to the partner. This goes obviously against Sharia principles. So what you have to do, you have to change these joint tenancies, jointly owned assets, from joint to tenants in common. So if you have tenants in common, this resolves the issue, which will then mean that the will now determine who gets the share of the partner who's passed away. And it's very easy to do this. Obviously, Land Registry, go to Land Registry website, and obviously there's a step-by-step instruction of how to make this change from joint tenancy to tenants in common if you need to do this. So hopefully this is very easy to understand. And obviously, if there are assets in joint names, I would say my advice would always be to contact a solicitor. We will obviously, at the end, I will provide you a will. I will show you a will as well. And I would really urge people to fill out a will. There are many online wills available nowadays. You can fill out any of them. You know, obviously, we've understood it's not permissible for somebody to not have a will in place. We've understood that from the hadith. One of the benefits of writing a will is that, you know, you can minimize the tax liabilities. Inheritance tax, obviously, is a tax on the estate of the person who dies. There's normally no inheritance tax to pay if one of these reasons, if the value of the estate is below 325,000, that's the threshold. If the value of their entire estate, that's in the entire estate, whatever they own, everything put together is below 325,000, then there's no inheritance tax. That's the nil rate band, as we call it. You leave, if you leave everything above 325 to your spouse, civil partner, or a charity, community, or community amateur sports club or something like that, then there's no tax on the above amount, anything above 325. And the standard inheritance tax rate is 40%. A large number is only charged on the part of your estate that's above the threshold. So anything above your nil rate band 325, you will be charged 40% on that. So let's take, for example, a person leaves an estate worth 400,000. Okay, their non-taxable allowance is 325,000. So therefore, they will be taxed 40% for the excess, which is 75,000. So this amounts to an inheritance tax of £30,000. So still, £30,000 inheritance tax, still a lot. It's very considerably, very high. And paying, for example, a tax advisor or a solicitor to have a valid will in place to be able to minimize these taxes by utilizing many of the methods that they have available to them. Legally, obviously, they do this all to minimize these tax rates. Will be making sense, isn't it? That even if you only have 70,000 above, 75,000 above the nil rate band, you're still being taxed at 30,000. Okay, is very high. So obviously, consequently, those with an estate above 325,000 are strongly advised to consult a solicitor in order to draw up a will, a proper will, as they will obviously. There may be scope to even double the non-taxable allowance to 650. They can do that by not using the spouse's nil rate tax band and passing it on to one spouse, and then you will have double the amount of tax allowance when that when a person passes away. So these are all things to take into consideration when looking at your assets and what to do when you are making a will. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. So just to summarize what we've done today, we went through the 14 categories of distribution from the estate of the deceased. So we went through firstly preparation for burial and shrouding, then debts, in order of priority. Then if there's money left over, then debts. Then if there's money left over, then goes to the bequest, the wasiyah. Then if there's money left over, that goes to the fixed Quranic shareholders, the Dhawil Furud, who we've done the table or previously of. Then if there's money left over, going to the agnatic shareholders, those who are receiving the remainder of the estate. If there are none, then it goes to emancipation shareholder, asabat as-sababi, which doesn't really apply nowadays. It's not too important. Then we do return to fixed Quranic shareholders. So if there's no agnetic shareholders, no number 5, number 6, then we go to back to number 4 again, and we redistribute amongst them. If there isn't any of them as well, then we'll go to Dhawil Arham, relatives who are related through womb ties. So in essence, those who are not already considered, any other relatives who are not already considered in essence. Then we will go to the voluntary liability shareholders, those who took liability for this person during their life. Then relatives whose relation is based on unsubstantiated claim, so we'll then give it to them. If there isn't any, then we go to the one who was bequeathed the entire estate by the deceased. Let's give it to them. If that's not the case as well, then we will put that money into the Baytul Mal, the public treasury, the state treasury. And if that's not there, like nowadays, then we'll return that money back to the spouse. And if there is no spouse of this person as well, then we'll have to then eventually give it to zakat eligible Muslims. So that's the way in terms of the distribution of the estate works. We went through rulings in regards to the burial and shrouding. We talked about how this will be done. Nowadays, generally, the shroud will be provided by the place where the ghusl, the bathing is taken place in any way. So that's not too big a problem. There's just maybe a little charge some places where the ghusl is taking place. Then we'll move on to repaying of the debts, and we talked about the debts that are owed to humans, the hukukul ibad, obviously take preference, and they will be the ones that will be given first. If the bequest is being made to fulfill the hukukullah, the debts that are owed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like zakat or anything like this, then that can also be given from maximum 1/3. And if there wasn't any bequest for that, then that cannot be given unless the heirs all consent. And those who consent, only from their portion of inheritance, these kind of debts will be fulfilled. We talked about the different hierarchy of debts, and then we went on to bequests. We went through many of the rulings there. Who can bequest be made for? Maximum 1/3 of the remaining estate can be used to fulfill the bequest. The bequest must be fulfilled, and it can't be made for something sinful. The bequest cannot be. If the bequest is made for something sinful, it won't be fulfilled. And these rulings. Then we went through also the rules of intestacy and the laws in regards to that. So a person should have a will in place to avoid that from happening. And also a will give a secondary benefit of trying to minimize any tax liabilities. So inheritance tax is 40%, and a will can be drawn up by experts who will be able to minimize these tax liabilities. So this is what we went through today.